Here in the African continent, let's take you to Egypt, where nearly 100 heads of state and government are meeting for 2 days in Sharm el-Sheikh. They're facing calls to deepen emissions cuts and financially back developing countries already devastated by the effects of rising temperatures. A multitude of other crises, from Russia's war in Ukraine to soaring inflation, has raised concerns that climate change will drop on the priority list of governments. But on Sunday, the heads of developing nations won a small victory when delegates agreed to put the controversial issue of compensation for loss and damage on the summit agenda. We have details in this report.
The hosting of the United Nations Climate Summit COP27 in Egypt this year marks the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Leaders from 120 countries are meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh to discuss next steps in curbing climate change. Key topics are compensation and support for the most affected countries. In a series of speeches, leaders urged rich countries to stay the course in stopping further climate change despite the war in Ukraine and global financial problems. While addressing the summit in his first international appearance since taking office, United Kingdom Prime Minister Rishi Sunak says, quote, President Putin's abhorrent war in Ukraine and rising energy prices across the world are not a reason to go slow on climate change, end of quote. He says climate and energy security go hand in hand. Speaking on the sidelines, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres reiterates that COP27 needs to define a clear roadmap to deal with the loss and damage in Pakistan, an institutional framework which includes financing. He appealed to the international financial institutions and to the G20 to create a condition for mechanism debt relief in middle-income countries affected by natural disasters.
If there is any doubt about loss and damage, go to Pakistan. There is loss and there is damage. And this COP needs to recognize it and needs to define a roadmap, a clear roadmap to deal with it, and including the creation of an institutional framework, including financing, in order to address the problems of loss and damage. And I hope that Pakistan will be able to benefit from these developments. My appeal.
Pakistan Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif joined the UN chief at a press encounter. He says his country is seeking to add loss and damage to the climate agenda.
Broader level, we seek to add loss and damage to the climate agenda, and we hope that all countries come to the COP27 meetings in the spirit you so ably championed as climate justice for all. My goal in the end is the same as yours, Excellency, to not let helplessness become a death sentence. In this race against time, let us plan on working towards that ambition, because what goes on in Pakistan will not stay in Pakistan.
U.S. President Joe Biden is due to arrive at the summit on Friday, while John Kerry, his special envoy for the climate, is already in attendance. The COP27 Global Climate Summit in Egypt is seen as crucial if climate change is to be brought under control. More than 200 countries are attending the summit to discuss further measures to cut emissions and prepare for climate change, and it could lead to major changes to our everyday lives.
Ibrahim Palm is the head ad interim of the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. He joins me live now from Egypt. Good to have you join us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So I just want to start with, I know President Buhari was represented by the Minister of the Environment, and that's Abdullahi Mohammed. And I just want to take a quote from him. He said, quote, that these glaring climate signals indicate that we do not have the luxury of time when it comes to the impacts of climate change. Now, I know you've been following the conversation in COP27 because you're there. How optimistic are you, considering that we have not been able to turn previous commitments into action?
Well, thank you. And the minister is absolutely right, speaking on behalf of the president. There is no time. There is a new urgency to the efforts to curb climate change, to reduce emissions, and to achieve the targets set to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I think this new urgency is very well felt. However, it's not to say that previous COPs have not achieved some measure of success. I think last year in Glasgow, we came really close in COP26 to phasing out coal. However, the agreement was to phase it down and to reduce by 45% carbon emissions by 2030. Nigeria announced an ambitious plan by 2060 to achieve net zero. And we have an energy transition plan that's been approved by the National Assembly in the Climate Change Act of 2021. There is progress on all fronts. There is optimism, but this COP is titled Together for Implementation. So we're moving from negotiation to implementation, and I think we're set to achieve great things.
And one of the most, if I would say, resounding conversation in this summit is the fact that people are saying, look, the emerging economies should get that compensation from the rich industrialized nation because they are the ones who are actually polluting the earth that is leading to the climate change disaster that has been experienced in the emerging economies. A lot of people also see COP27 holding in Africa as a very rare privilege for the continent. So what concerted effort should African leaders make in terms of getting compensation from industrialized nations?
No, I think the arguments are very well stated. And the whole discussion around loss and damage goes to the core of the discussion, the advocacy for climate justice. And those arguments are clear. Having loss and damage on the agenda finally for the COP is a major step forward. You only need to look at Pakistan, and I'm glad you had the discussion about Pakistan's floods, but also at Nigeria, we've had incredible floods this year, which have resulted in major impacts. So damage to infrastructure, threat to food security, health issues. We're beginning to see in much more graphic form what the whole argument about loss and damage is. And as the UN Secretary General mentioned, you only need to look at Pakistan, and I dare say Nigeria as well, to see that there is loss and there's damage. That needs to be compensated. And I think there's a shift in attitude from the industrialized countries. We're beginning to see that discussion is firmly on the table. And I do expect that by the end of COP27, we would have achieved some way forward in setting out loss and damage. By the way, Denmark is the first country to have set up a loss and damage fund already. So that train has left the station, and I'm sure that there will be greater successes to report.
And talk to us about that energy transition partnership, because I know that it was also stated in President Buhari's speech, as read by the Minister of the Environment. He requested, President Buhari requested the inclusion of Nigeria in the G7's climate change partnerships, the list for co-creation of a just energy transition partnership. And it's going to require at least $10 billion a year, and Nigeria does really need funding. So talk to us about that.
Well, certainly. I mean, again, the discussion around the just energy transition is founded on very solid grounds. And the president has made a strong argument in that regard. Nigeria's energy transition is largely based on gas and solar energy. And that has to be the pathway for us to achieve a smooth energy transition. The cost by 2060, I believe, would range somewhere around $410 billion. Those arguments are being made on all fronts. The vice president was in the US recently, and he made strong arguments in that regard. In fact, coming up with a new initiative, Debt for Climate, which I think it would do well for Western countries to see the need to support these arguments, to put the money that is required behind these initiatives. And one of the avenues for channeling these monies is through the financial mechanisms of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I refer particularly to the Green Climate Fund where I work. I think there is every need to fund, to put the resources behind these funds, $100 billion a year at the minimum. Look, we have 3.4 billion people all around the world in rural areas who are suffering the worst effects of climate change, from droughts to flooding to erosion of coastal communities. These are the people who are at the focus of the discussions, and we must keep that firmly in view.
Absolutely. It's a lot for emerging economies to grapple with, from adaptation to issues around transition to clean energy. Thank you so much for talking to us. As the summit continues, we look forward to speaking to you more in this regard. Ibrahim Palm, head ad interim of the Independent Redress Mechanism of the Green Climate Fund.